Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Beckham and the subject here is creating a panorama. There are some photographers who specialize in taking and creating panoramas, and they often invest in a special addition for their tripod that gives them far more consistent results. Many of us don't specialize, of course, but maybe we want to try a panorama when the circumstances present themselves. When I'm shooting a panorama myself, I usually set my camera to a manual exposure. I take the images in portrait mode and I carefully take a series of handheld shots, sometimes on a tripod, with a healthy overlap. Just taking a little bit of care to stay level usually works okay. What we're going to do here is to demonstrate the stitching and editing part of creating a panorama. But I'd like to use a few images shot by my son from his drone. But the taking technique is exactly the same, whether you're taking your images from a tripod, handheld, or from a drone. So whatever we use to capture the images, from there, in Adobe Camera Raw, it's all much the same. In fact, my son, who isn't a photographer, made a little bit of an error here. He had the camera on his drone set to 16:9 aspect ratio, and not the 4:3 aspect ratio that possibly would have been a little bit better. But the good news is we're really putting Photoshop to the test here. Now, the really good part of making a panoramic image with Photoshop these days is now we can stitch a batch of raw images, and at the end of the process we're left with a raw image. That didn't always used to be the case. So let's give it a go with these 8 images here. I'm going to select all 8. If I select the first one and hold the Shift key and the last, it'll select all of those in between. And I can hit the Enter key and all of these will be opened up into Adobe Camera Raw. Now you can see all of the thumbnails being shown to us down the left hand side, and there's 1 or 2 that are hidden down below. What I'm going to do is to select all of those. Now I think it may be just as well to use the shortcut key Control A, which is a universal shortcut which is select all. Now I could go ahead and start creating the panorama from here, but just before I do, and knowing what we know about the lens corrections and how we can correct for known distortion in a lens, it may be a good idea to do that first if we're then going to ask Photoshop to stitch all of these images together. So I'm going to go to the right hand side of the screen, and I'm going to go up to my lens corrections, and I may as well tick to remove chromatic aberration, but also tick the box to enable the profile corrections. Now you can see it's picked up the lens that's being used on the drone and Mavic Pro, so hopefully it's going to help us to stitch all of these thumbnails together. The process goes something like this. If we go up to the top right of the thumbnails, there's a little icon here, and if I click that, I can select Merge to Panorama. So let's take a look at the options we have in the Panorama Merge preview. I'm going to start by removing the tick here. Now you'll see what happens to the image. It's showing us without the crop, so we've got areas around here that we would have to repair. Now when I tick the box, it actually doesn't look awfully bad, does it? But it depends how we shot the images. Sometimes we can get a little bit more in the areas we would need to repair. And also there are times when we can start to think, well, shall I allow Adobe Camera Raw to crop this image? Or shall I wait until I get into Photoshop? Because if I actually don't want to crop the entire width or the entire height, I may be able to use some of the powerful tools like ContentAware to fill in some of these areas. So what I'm going to do is leave this unticked. Another option we have is the boundary warp, but as I move this slider to the right and as we view what it does to the picture, I may as well just tick the auto crop. So on this occasion I'll leave it off. We've got three options here, always worth clicking them and seeing the sort of result we get in the preview. This one I think we're going to get quite a little noise from Windows as it tells us it's not going to like it. Let me click it and show you. Selected projection is invalid for this image set. What that means, I do not have a clue. So we'll just shut that down, but what we'll do is go back to the spherical and have a look at that, and the cylindrical. You see, I quite like the cylindrical looking at this here. So I'm going to move forward with it by clicking merge. The first thing we're asked to do here is to save the merged file. It even gives us a name. I'm happy with that, and it's going to put it in the same folder where the images were originally kept. So I'm going to click save and allow it to do that. Now it's going to take, well, I was going to say it's going to take a little while, but it's actually done it rather quickly. If you look down at the bottom of the layered stack, you can now see the panorama that's been created for us. Now what I've done here is just click the Done button in Adobe Camera Raw just to bring you back into Bridge to show you what we have. Obviously we've still got the 8 original images and we've got our pano. But it does give us an opportunity to see that it's quite large, 8,500 pixels by 4,200. What I'm going to do is to reopen this now into Adobe Camera Raw and we can go through the editing process. So double clicking and it'll appear. So we need to think about what we're going to do first. Now I think the first thing I need to do is to straighten that horizon. So I'm going to go to my straighten tool from the toolbar at the top of the screen and draw a line along the horizon. So I'm telling Photoshop that part should be straight. Now you can see that the crop is touching the edge there, so I cannot move the crop up and I cannot move the crop down. But I've got pretty good composition here. But if I accept the crop as it is, I also, and I'll hit the enter key to do that, I do have one or two areas that I need to repair a little bit later. Now if you've already watched my video on ContentAware, you'll probably also be aware that they are unlikely to be a great problem. So where do we start from here? Well, we need to go to the Basic tab on the right hand side, which is already open. And we also need to look up at the histogram at the top of the screen. And when we do, we can see that we've got a little bit of a deficiency here in the blacks. Maybe we're okay with the highlights, but we've got a deficiency with the whites. So let's start with those two sliders. Looking at the histogram on the right, if I move the whites to the right, you can see the histogram is stretched out to almost touch that side. And if I take my blacks and take it the other way, you can see I can add an awful lot of impact with just the movement of those two. But I'm being guided by my histogram at the top of the screen. Now the camera on a Mavic Pro drone doesn't have interchangeable lenses, of course. It's rather like a compact camera. So we don't have to worry about dust spots in the sky here at all. All we need is colour, clarity and some wow value if we can create it. I think the colour's pretty good, but let's have a look at a little bit of clarity. I quite like the effect there. Let's have a look at a little bit of dehaze. I don't think it's going to be that good. Maybe not. I think I'll take that back. Maybe just a little bit of it. Just a touch. Maybe a little more clarity. Maybe even a little less or a little more black, or even dropping the exposure down just a touch. Remember, when we do this sort of work, there's some rights and wrongs and an awful lot of personal preference. Now I think the next thing we have to consider is the sky, to try to give that a similar sort of impact to the rest of the image. So I'm going to go to my graduated filters. I'm going to click and drag to drag that down the screen. I'll hold the shift key, make sure I get a nice straight gradient filter there, and I'm going to right click within it and reset all the local settings. Then I'm going to touch the V key to hide the overlay. Remember, if you forget the shortcut keys, you'll find you can turn off the overlay down at the bottom of the palette on the right. So now I want to improve the sky as best I can. Now we've got quite a few bright clouds in there, but none of them are burnt out, which is good news. But let's take a look. If we step down the highlights, that has some impact, but I'll send it back quickly. Let's try some exposure. That looks okay, but it then tends to need a little bit more impact. Maybe contrast. Maybe let's try the clarity again. And maybe even a smidgen of that dehaze. And now I've changed my mind about the exposure, and I think I can come up just a little bit. But you can see there I've got quite a bit of impact in that sky, and it matches nicely with most of the rest of the image. And remember, we can sometimes put a second gradient in place. If I touch my V key, what I could do is either select the new gradient option from over on the right hand side, or I can just click and drag and a new one will be created. So if I wanted to make something just a little bit heavier right on the top, then maybe I could do that, although it does tend to make the blue a little bit too blue maybe. So I'll investigate taking the saturation down on that second one, but a little more in the exposure. Now I think they're all going to be a little more personal than rights and wrongs here. What else would we need to do? Well, probably not a lot. The only thing I was thinking of was lifting the tones in the middle there, and we could do that with a brush. So if I select my adjustment brush and just brush once or twice to create a pin, I can take a look over here. I've got enough sliders moved to be able to go back, right click and reset them, because all I want to do here is to try to lift the color a little bit. Maybe lift the shadows just a little bit, maybe a little bit of exposure. Just now start to paint over this area and look at what I'm doing, just lifting that middle distance to draw our attention in there. But I think I'm happy now to open this up into Photoshop. Now with the image open in Photoshop, I'm going to take you to the layers and open them up, and we can see that we've got a smart object here. So I've got a nice route back to Adobe Camera Raw should I need it. But in fact I'm going to have to lose this pretty quick, because the next job I'd like to do is to use ContentAware Fill to fix those four corners, and I cannot do that while retaining a smart object. So I'm going to go to the right of the thumbnail, right click and choose rasterize. There it is, rasterize layer. I don't really have to worry overly much though, because if I really did want to go back into Camera Raw, I could just go back to Bridge and select the thumbnail from there, and we would then be back with a raw file. I'm going to drop the size of this down a little bit so I can get around the edges. So I'm using a nice little shortcut of Control Alt Spacebar. Sounds more difficult than it is, that one. Although it's 3 keys, they do fall nicely to the fingers. And that's all I wanted to do. So let's have a go at these four corners. Hopefully we'll get that done pretty quick. I'm going to select my polygonal lasso tool, and I'll select a lasso shape down there and up and around. I'll do them one at a time. Edit, Fill, ContentAware. Control D removes the selection. We can zoom in and just take a look to make sure we're happy with the picture. Now we're up to almost 150% there, and it looks good to me. So on the strength of that, I'm going to go ahead and tackle the big one down the bottom. So once again, click, 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 click. Move down and around. Edit. Fill. OK to that. It shouldn't have a problem given that we're just looking at the sea there, and that looks good too. And I'll do this one, which again shouldn't give us any difficulty at all. I haven't tried doing these all in one go, but I tend to think it makes a bit of sense to keep the pressure off of our computers sometimes. And finally this one, and again the nature of the sky being as it is, I very much doubt that's going to give us a problem either. Control D will remove the selection. Control 0 fits the image on screen, and we can have a timeout and think about if there's anything else we need to do. Now with the spinning round of the screen, what I'd like to do is to pick up my sponge tool. I want to do a little bit of strategic extra saturation of colour. Now that's grouped with the dodge and burn tool. There's the one I want. We're going to be using a standard soft edge brush. I need to select saturate from the options at the top of the screen. I'm going to press the button there so I can change the flow with the number keys on the keyboard. So I'm going to go for 10% to start with, and what I'd like to do is zoom in a bit as well. I just thought I would try to lift the warm tones in the sand here. Now that looks a little bit heavy to me, so I'm going to drop that down to 5% and just warm up the tones in the sand a little bit. The sand is catching quite a bit of the light. Maybe the rocks, we can warm them up a little bit around the edge, make it a little bit more of that colour. The sand being kicked up in the surf there, and around here just lifting. You can see I'm working with the tool in a very measured way, and of course we can use it too if we wanted to try to lift any of the other colours elsewhere. But I think we've got a pretty colourful picture in the sea where we can see the shadows probably caused by the light coming through the clouds. Normally you get this sort of effect when you have deep areas of the sea and shallow, but I think it's all pretty shallow there. So the only other thing we would think about doing maybe would be to maybe a little bit of vignetting around the outer edge, but other than that I think we've got a pretty successful panoramic shot. Now I'm going to have a go at creating a vignette here, just a delicate one. I'm going to pick up my freehand lasso tool and I'm going to draw a freehand shape around the edge. We can always do this with an oval shape, and we've seen that done a few times in Camera Raw, but it doesn't have to be an oval shape. But of course at the moment it's inside of this selection which is editable, not outside, and I want the outside editable. So I need to inverse my selection. So we've got a selection made. We'll find the command for that in the select menu. Go to the top of the screen, select, there it is, inverse. I'm going to need to soften the edge of this considerably. I'm going to go to select and mask. We've got a number of ways we can view the edge. We can see it black and white, we can see it on layers, so we can see the image, we can see it on white, on black, with an overlay. To be honest, they're all going to work here, but black and white is pretty good for most things we do. I need to move the feather up, but I know I'm going to need it 400 pixels plus, so I'm going to take a gamble here and just over type the value with 450, and that looks pretty good. So I'm going to click OK to actually soften the edge of my selection. Now this is one of those times when I think the selection is best hidden. Here in the main screen of Photoshop we need Control H. That toggles the selection into a hidden state, and Control H again will bring it back. But let's leave it hidden because I want to bring up my levels from the Image menu. Image, Adjustment, Levels. I'll put that in the middle because all I want is a little bit of mid-tone just coming in on the edges there. If I tick and untick the preview, you can see it's not significant. If the image was opened up, no one would notice that we'd actually placed a vignette there, but it has a positive effect. Click OK to accept it. Control H to reveal it, or Control D to remove it, and I think we've got a pretty good result. Now it's probably fair to say that the actual process of creating the original panorama before we started to do the manipulation was really quite easy and quick. But isn't it great that we can now shoot our panoramic images in RAW, stitch them together, and still have that RAW file to do the final work, to give the image that impact and appeal.